A few hours later, a little past noon, they landed in a patch of forest on top of a tall, jagged cliff that lined the coast. The waves of the ocean crashed below. The sea was gray and monotonous. Ice drifts crashed into each other and were flung against the foot of the cliff by the 3 to 5 meter tall waves. The snowstorm was even more severe than at Coltus, being further north. Jolkin Cliff formed during the start of the apocalypse more than 40 years ago. The overhanging cliff hid the indentations and cracks in the stone below, therefore making it an excellent hidden camp for the Imperialists. However, it did make sneaking up to them easier. Arda crash-landed in a soft pillow of snow and freed himself from the straps, cords, and the stirrup. The bag had automatically sucked in the paraglider, and the bridge glider had returned to its normal state. He stood up and shook the snow from his hair as Karato gathered the rest of the stealth team. He pointedly ignored Blake's soft, stifled laughter from behind him as he walked towards the colonel, covered with white flakes. If he was none the wiser, he would have thought he had gray hair. "The sentries are posted in these locations," Karato was saying, a map displayed on a device much like a tablet, but with a transparent, clear screen. The map was of Jolkin Cliff and displayed their location as well as the Imperialist sentries and guards. They had landed a few hundred meters away from the closest sentry to avoid detection. "You all remember the plan, right? Head out in exactly 1 hour, locate the supply within 2 hours, scout out the camp roughly, send the information ahead, and try to stay put. Reinforcements will be there in 10 minutes, and we'll get the drifter in position in approximately 20 to 30 minutes. The drifter had been put in place some way south, parked on the side of the cliff and hidden about 2 days prior. It was a vehicle much like a hovercraft on Earth, able to drift on water in disguise as an ice drift. However, if it were to approach the Imperialist camp, there was no chance of it getting close without alerting them. Arda had briefly wondered why they didn't just use the drifters to get to Jolkin Cliff, but then he realized fuel was another thing that was scarce. They couldn't waste any more than necessary. He nodded along with the rest of the stealth group, which consisted of Tink, as well as 2 other members, Junko and Loris, cousins, who excelled in information gathering and, by extension, stealth. Tink handed them some pouches that clipped to their belts and consisted of a rope that could be used for a quick escape down the cliff if things went south. They were briefed again on the one blind spot in the guards around the Jolkin Cliff and given something to eat. An hour later, they gathered at the edge of the makeshift North Sphere camp in the snow. "Alright, let's go, kids," Tink said as they started moving through the trees. "We're not kids," Junko muttered, leading the team as they headed diagonally north and toward where the cliff dropped steeply into the ocean. He had a hand on his gun the entire time, moving quickly. "You're 16, Tink pointed out quietly. "That classifies you as a kid. You're not even older than Blake." "Well, technically, 16 was considered the age of maturity in many periods in history, according to Professor T. But we're not in those periods in history, are we, kid?" Tink reached forward and ruffled Junko's black hair, who smacked her hand out away. "Don't be so grouchy about it. Come on. You're only like 20. That's only a few years older than me." "Yes, and I've reached adulthood and can vote in North Sphere. You can't." Yeah, whatever." A level 7 earthquake shook the ground, and a few trees crashed into the soft snow. Thunder boomed overhead. Arda had a strange feeling in his gut. It wasn't his developing personality, he was sure of it. It was a strange tug, an urge, and he couldn't quite explain it. It seemed to make him abandon all the feelings he did ever have, however. He was suddenly empty, like a cup tipped to his side, its contents that he had been storing the past 11 days spilling onto the ground. It influenced him in a way he couldn't understand, and he didn't like it. He suddenly couldn't feel, reminding him what it had been like in space, and he'd forgotten how lonely it was. But he put it aside for now and focused on the mission at hand. Laura stayed out of the conversation, her sharp brown eyes darting around. Not that it mattered if she'd participated in the bantering or not, because soon Tink and Junko quieted down as they approached the earshots of a sentry hidden somewhere in the forest. "Drop," Loris whispered. "Now." No one needed being told twice, and they dropped to their stomachs, using the snow and trees as cover. Even Arda couldn't see where the sentry was, or knew how Loris knew that they were looking their way. He knew the sentries used a unique Imperialist tech that allowed them to rise up and seemingly float in midair for a few hours at a time. The North Sphere hadn't been able to copy it, despite numerous attempts. They waited in tense silence for what seemed like a long time. It wasn't long before she told them to move to the cliff, however, and they ran at a crouch, the wind negating nearly all sounds. A guard was on the cliff as well, watching for drifters and North Spheres scaling the stone. But there was a precise moment when all sentries were looking the other direction, and a gap was created. It lasted for at most 8 seconds, and at least 2, as reported by members sent to scout out the guard's schedule a week ago. It would be enough for them to hop onto the cliff and run past the guard. They had to cover around 10 meters before they were in the clear. The schedule hadn't changed, and the gap was still there, but once they got through, they had to somehow make a break for the crack in the cliff 10 meters down, or else they would be spotted once the sentry at the top of the Jokin cliff, which would be just 20 meters away, would turn back around for 4 seconds later after the gap closed behind them. Once they got there, they had a straight line to the camp, and they would be in the clear from perimeter watches. They just had to avoid the sentry at the top of the cliff, who turned around approximately every 5 minutes, more than enough to get to the camp. They crouched in the snow, nearly covered in it, as they waited for Loris and Junko to give the signal. Loris had a particular way of counting, and seemed to have something akin to photographic memory, the reason she was so good with information itself. Junko worked well with her, backing her up with the practical side of it. "Alright, we're good in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!" Junko went first, grabbing onto the branch of the tree on the very edge of the cliff, jumping and swinging down to stand on the side of the cliff. He had warned that this part would be the most dangerous. On the cliff, they were the most vulnerable and visible, with only the falling snow and fog to cover them, but it was nowhere near enough. The stone would always be more difficult for the boots to attach to, so they couldn't run or they might fall. They could run along the top of the cliff, but chances were they wouldn't have enough time to get into the hidden crack in the stone before being spotted. Tink swung down next, then Loris, and Arda covered the rear, his boots lighting up as he crouched on the cliff, his back against it, sort of sitting on his heels. He cautiously followed the rest of the group. Tink turned around briefly and gestured her wrist at him, which had her wristband on it. She mouthed, "Swing." Arda understood and tapped his own wristband against the stone. It lit up, and he held his breath as he pushed off the cliff with his legs and swung on one arm, turning and nearly slamming into the cliffside. He stopped himself with his legs, once again crouching beside the cliff in a slightly more precarious position. He detached his wristband and reached out with his other arm, seeing the others do the same. A few dozen meters below, a guard was walking down the cliff, a rifle in hand, orange scarf around their neck. They slowed to a stop and tapped the rifle against the cliff a few times, scanning the waterline and the cliffs below. Then, they started to turn around. Arda still had a few meters to cross to get out of their line of sight, Loris had swung to safety and was gradually dropping down toward the crack in the cliff, a nearly invisible dark vertical line hidden by a curve in the stone. He could see a joking cliff clearly, a dark gray shape jutting out above the ocean, grand and sturdy, having stood against the countless earthquakes over more than 30 years since its creation. He could also just make out a dark shape floating above, almost visible up against the clouds and snow. Arda had to assume he was facing the other way. Tink poked her head out of the crack and urgently beckoned to Arda. The guard below them turned slowly, scanning the cliff. Arda didn't have time. He had to jump for it. He could make it, he calculated. The crack was down and to the side a few meters, but it was possible. If he jumped now, he could. Just before he pushed off the stone, an earthquake shook the coastline. He had already detached from the cliff and was falling through the air, a little too far from the stone. Tink's hand reached out and just touched his, but slipped before she could grab it. Arda fell further. He couldn't correct his course now. His body leaned forward in the wind, however, and his wristband lit up with a line of blue light as it attached to the cliff. His arm yanked him toward the stone. The weak magnetic pull made him slide another meter as his body slammed against the cliffside before he hung there for a brief second, feeling a slight sting of pain in his shoulder. He must have dislocated it. The guard had turned around, but Arda was out of their sight. That meant the gap had closed, and that meant he had 4 precious seconds before he was spotted. He couldn't move his right arm for the time being. He would just have to make do. Arda put a foot against the stone, and the boot lit up. He crouched cautiously and let his right arm hang as his left one helped him move up the cliff steadily, trying to go as fast as he can without the threat of falling again. Falling and falling with no control loomed over him. He'd already lost 2 seconds, and there were 3 more meters left to climb. Above him in the crack, a hand, Loris's, stuck out and held out 2 fingers. Helpful. Tink's head appeared, and she held out her hand to him, a panicked expression evident on her face, even behind the goggles and mask. Another meter covered, 1 more until he could reach the hand Tink was holding out. Loris's middle finger went down. 1 more second. Arda reached out and grabbed Tink's outstretched hand with the left. The woman used a surprising amount of strength to yank him up and into the narrow crack in the cliff, just as Loris's arm retreated as her index also went down, closing her hand into a fist. There was a brief moment of silence, broken only by the wind howling. No alarm sounded, nothing suggested that Arda had been spotted. Junko sighed, a hand over his chest. That was too close for comfort. Loris nodded in agreement. Arda looked at Tink, who seemed to have calmed down, but still seemed worried. You could have used your tie or the rope for extra reach. Tink smiled behind her mask and rolled her eyes. What, and waste like 2 seconds? Kid, I had no time to think. Unlike you with that brain of yours. Pop. Everyone flinched. What was that sound? Lars exclaimed. There was no need to worry about their voices attracting attention. The crack hit them well, and the wind and ocean drowned out most noises. She looked at Arda concernedly, as he was, after all, the source of the sound. Arda flexed his right arm, his left hand rubbing his shoulder where his humerus, his upper arm bone, was connected by a joint to his scapula, also known as his shoulder blades. He believed he did it right. The stinging pain was gone, and it was moving without much pain aside from a slight soreness. Even if he didn't, his system would just pop it back in place in a few minutes automatically. I popped my shoulder back in place, Arda explained, straight-faced. I dislocated it when I fell and caught myself with my wristband. I'll be fine. His statement was met with stares from 3 people. Tink sighed and patted his shoulder, right where he injured it. It didn't hurt. It was nothing compared to breaking every bone in one's body after falling from outer space, but he didn't feel like she was doing it on purpose. Don't worry about this guy. He's special. I believe you've heard. Oh, right. Isn't he set out to leave tonight? Loris asked. This was the most she had spoken so far. I heard from Karata you only staying on Zeta for a fortnight. Then you're leaving. Arda knew she meant well, but he couldn't help but point out, in the privacy of his mind, that her wording made it seem like he had a choice in the matter. He did not. He nodded nonetheless. How are we on time? Loris looked up at the stone walls of the little hiding spot. A little more than 30 minutes since we left on time. 4 minutes and 7 seconds were remaining until the guard turns around. Let's catch our breaths here. You have your scarves, right? They all took out a bright orange scarf from their individual pockets and wrapped it around their necks, tugging the white ties in their hoodie. The disguise wouldn't last long, but it was enough to throw the Imperialist for a loop. Junko piped in. Just walk fast but steadily. Don't fall, don't look uncertain at all. The Imperialists are proud. They walk like it. Even if we were found out, we would lose them in the camp. For now, let's just rest, because that scare made my heart go at a rate that is not helpful for the body. Junko laid down and put his visor over his eyes. Alright, now don't disturb me until the time is up. I'm taking a 5-minute nap. A moment later, he was snoring on the uncomfortable, thin slash in the cliff.